He's just a warehouse worker. My wife's dad told his business partners. My wife's sister smirked. So embarrassing. I smiled silently. The TV in the room began. Meet the tech world's newest billion-dollar CEO. Look, I've survived a lot of uncomfortable situations in my 29 years on this planet. I've sat through 4-hour board meetings where venture capitalists argued about the font size on our pitch deck. I've endured software deployment disasters at 3 in the morning while surviving on stale coffee and the crushing weight of investor expectations. Hell, I once had to fire my best friend's cousin because he kept using company servers to mine Bitcoin. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for the psychological warfare disguised as a friendly dinner invitation from my father-in-law, Harold Lansing. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon while I was debugging a critical algorithm that would save our clients approximately $12 million annually in operational costs. You know, just casual Tuesday stuff. Harold's voice boomed through my speakerphone with that particular brand of condescension that only wealthy men who peaked in the 80s seemed to master. "Noah, my boy," he said, and I could practically hear the golf clap in his tone. "I'm having my quarterly business dinner at Morton Steakhouse this Friday. Thought it might be good for you to attend. Meet some successful people, you know? Maybe someone there can help you find a real job." A real job. Those 3 words hung in the air like a fart in an elevator. Impossible to ignore and deeply offensive. I had to physically bite down on my tongue hard enough to taste copper because the alternative was explaining to my wife why I'd just told her father exactly where he could shove his quarterly business dinner. Here's the thing that made my eye twitch. I'd been running Flowgrid systems for 5 years. 5 entire years of 16-hour days, cold pizza at midnight, and enough stress to give a Buddhist monk an anxiety disorder. We had 128 employees who depended on me for their mortgages, their kids' braces, their dreams of actually retiring before they turned 80. We were pulling in $360 million in annual revenue. $360 million. Our client list read like a who's who of national retailers. Companies that Harold probably shopped at without ever wondering how their products magically appeared on shelves. But because I didn't strut around in a 3-piece suit that cost more than most people's cars, because I didn't have some mahogany-paneled corner office with my name on a brass plaque, because I actually preferred hoodies to ties and believed that good ideas mattered more than good cufflinks, Harold Lansing had somehow convinced himself that his son-in-law was basically a glorified forklift operator who'd accidentally stumbled into a job with an email address. In his mind, I probably spent my days moving pallets around some dusty warehouse, maybe updating a spreadsheet if I was feeling particularly ambitious, definitely not running a billion-dollar logistics optimization platform that was literally revolutionizing supply chain management across 3 continents. The worst part? My wife Sophie had internalized her father's delusion. When I hung up the phone and she asked what Harold wanted, I told her about the dinner invitation. She got that look. You know the one. The expression that says, "Please don't make this difficult for me," mixed with "I love you, but also my father controls my trust fund." She clasped her hands together like she was about to pray for my soul and said, "Please, just smile and don't mention your warehouse thing." My warehouse thing. My billion-dollar baby, my 5 years of blood, sweat, and probably a concerning amount of tears, reduced to a thing. Like it was some weird hobby I did in my spare time, like building model trains or collecting vintage lunchboxes. I wanted to pull up our quarterly earnings report, point at the numbers that would make a small country's GDP look cute, and ask her to read them out loud until she understood what the hell her husband actually did for a living. But I didn't. Because I loved her, and because I learned that sometimes you have to pick your battles. And sometimes those battles involve pretending you're totally fine with being underestimated by people who think success only counts if it comes with a corner office and a secretary named Deborah. So I agreed. Of course I agreed. Because that's what you do when you're married and you want to stay that way. I told her I'd go. I'd smile. I'd be pleasant. And I'd try my absolute hardest not to embarrass her in front of her father's circle jerk of self-important businessmen who probably still thought the internet was just a fad. Sophie looked so relieved I thought she might actually cry. "Thank you," she said, kissing my cheek. "And maybe dress nice? Like business nice. Business nice. Right. Because showing up in jeans and a black turtleneck to a steakhouse would somehow shatter the fragile ecosystem of Harold's ego-driven dinner party. But here's where I decided to have a little fun with it. If they were going to treat me like some clueless warehouse worker anyway, why should I dress up like I was trying to impress them? Why should I squeeze into some uncomfortable suit and pretend to be someone I wasn't, just to make Harold feel validated in his assessment of me? Screw that. I was going to show up exactly as I was. Jeans, black turtleneck, and my best calm before the storm expression that I'd perfected over years of dealing with incompetent middle managers and investors who thought they knew my business better than I did. Friday rolled around with all the enthusiasm of a root canal appointment. I stood in front of my closet, looking at the one suit I owned, the one I'd bought for my wedding and hadn't touched since, and I laughed. Actually laughed out loud like a maniac. Sophie poked her head into the bedroom, already dressed in some elegant cocktail dress that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe combined. "What's funny?" she asked, suspicious. "Nothing," I said, grabbing my favorite pair of dark jeans and my lucky black turtleneck, the one I'd worn when we'd closed our Series B funding. "Just thinking about how tonight's going to be a real educational experience." She frowned but didn't push it. 20 minutes later, we were in the car heading to Morton's, and I could feel Sophie's anxiety radiating off her in waves. She kept glancing at my outfit, then at me, then back at my outfit, like if she looked hard enough I might spontaneously transform into the corporate clone her father wanted me to be. "You look casual," she finally said, which in wife speak translated to, "You look like you're about to disappoint my entire family." "I look comfortable," I corrected. "There's a difference." She sighed, that deep, exhausted sigh that married people perfect over time. "Just, please don't mention Flowgrid. Don't talk about work. Don't get into it with my dad. Just smile, eat your steak, and let's get through this. Don't mention the company I'd built from scratch. Don't talk about the thing I was most passionate about. Just sit there like a good little son-in-law and let Harold and his buddies pat each other on the back for being so very successful while I nodded along like an extra in the background of their personal business theater. Sure, absolutely. What could possibly go wrong? As we pulled into the parking lot of Morton's, I saw Harold standing outside in his power suit, checking his Rolex like time itself owed him money. He spotted our car, and his face did this micro-expression thing. A flash of disappointment, so quick you'd miss it if you weren't looking for it. But I was looking for it. I was always looking for it. This was going to be one hell of a dinner. The moment I stepped out of the car, Harold's eyes locked onto my outfit with the kind of horror usually reserved for natural disasters or finding out your accountant has been creative with your taxes. He looked at my jeans, then at my turtleneck, then back at my jeans, like maybe if he blinked hard enough I'd transform into someone wearing a proper suit with a tie that cost more than a mortgage payment. His face went through this fascinating journey of emotions: confusion, disappointment, resignation, and finally landing on barely concealed disgust. It was like watching someone discover their lottery ticket was one number off, except the lottery ticket was me and the winning number was apparently dressing like you give a damn. "That's what you're wearing, Noah?" he asked, his voice carrying that special tone that parents use when their teenager shows up to church in ripped jeans and a band t-shirt. The question wasn't really a question, of course. It was an accusation wrapped in confusion, seasoned with a healthy dose of "what the hell is wrong with you?" I could feel Sophie tense up beside me, probably calculating how quickly we could fake a family emergency and bail, but I just smiled. That calm, unbothered smile that I'd perfected over years of dealing with people who underestimated me. "Yeah," I said, adjusting my turtleneck like it was the finest cashmere known to mankind. Didn't want to overdress and make the CEOs insecure. You know how fragile executive egos can be. Harold's eye twitched. Actually twitched. It was beautiful. Sophie grabbed my arm with enough force to cut off circulation, which in marriage language means shut up right now or you're sleeping on the couch for a month. But I was already committed to this bit. If they wanted to treat me like some clueless kid who didn't know how to dress for a business dinner, then fine. I'd play the part and enjoy every second of their judgment. Harold turned without another word and started walking toward the entrance of Morton's, his shoulders rigid with disapproval. I followed, Sophie practically dragging me along, whispering urgent pleas for me to just behave and not make this worse. Worse than what? I wanted to ask. Worse than being introduced as the warehouse guy? Worse than being treated like I peaked in high school? But I kept my mouth shut because I was saving all my commentary for the main event. The restaurant was exactly what you'd expect. Dark wood, low lighting, the kind of place where the steaks cost more than most people's weekly grocery budget, and the wine list requires a sommelier with a PhD to navigate. Harold led us through the main dining area toward a private room in the back, and with each step, I could feel the atmosphere getting thicker with testosterone and expensive cologne. We walked through heavy wooden doors into what can only be described as a peacock convention. I'm talking about a room full of men who'd clearly spent more time on their hair than I'd spent on my entire wedding vows. Polished hairlines that screamed, "I pay someone $300 for this cut." Watches that could probably fund a small nation's healthcare system. Cufflinks that definitely, absolutely, 100% had their own insurance policies. These guys looked like they'd been assembled in a factory that produced generic successful businessman Model 2.0, complete with the same confident posture, the same practiced handshake, and the same ability to talk about golf for 45 minutes without taking a breath. Before I could even process the sheer amount of net worth crammed into one room, Sophie's sister Lydia materialized from the crowd like a designer-clad ghost. She was sipping wine with the kind of casual entitlement that suggested the glass owed her rent, holding it at that specific angle that screamed, "I went to a liberal arts college and now I have opinions about tannins." Her eyes swept over me from head to toe, and I could literally see the judgment forming in real time. It was like watching someone calculate an insult, carrying the snark, adding the sarcasm. "So that's your outfit?" she asked, her voice dripping with enough condescension to drown a small village. It wasn't a question. It was an indictment, an accusation, a formal declaration that I had, in her expert opinion, failed at the basic human task of dressing appropriately. "Yep," I said, popping the P for maximum effect. "My other billionaire outfits at the cleaners. You know how it is. So many galas, so few dry cleaners who can handle that level of fancy." Lydia's face did this thing where she couldn't decide if I was joking or just incredibly stupid, so she settled on eye rolling so hard I worried about her optical health. "So embarrassing," she muttered, just loud enough for me to hear, but quiet enough that she could deny it if confronted. Classic Lydia move. She'd perfected the art of the backhanded comment, the subtle dig, the kind of insult that left you wondering if you should be offended or if you were just being too sensitive. Spoiler alert, you should definitely be offended, and you're not being too sensitive. Harold, meanwhile, had started making the rounds, introducing me to his collection of successful friends like I was some charity case he'd taken on. "Gentlemen," he announced with the enthusiasm of someone presenting a particularly disappointing science fair project, "this is my son-in-law, Noah. He works in warehouses." The way he said warehouses made it sound like I'd confessed to a crime. Like I'd stood up at a family dinner and announced I was a professional mime or a guy who collected toenail clippings for a living. The men in the room turned to look at me with varying degrees of polite interest and thinly veiled pity. I could see it in their eyes, the mental calculation happening, the quick assessment. Warehouses, manual labor, probably makes $40,000 a year if he's lucky. Poor Sophie, marrying down like that. "Actually," I said, keeping my voice pleasant and even, "I build software that manages logistics operations. Supply chain optimization, inventory management, route planning, that kind of thing." Harold waved his hand dismissively, like I'd just tried to explain quantum physics to a toddler. "So, warehouses," he repeated, as if I'd confirmed his initial assessment rather than corrected it. The man had the listening comprehension of a brick wall. "Exactly," I said, because what else was there to say? I could have pulled out my phone and shown them our company website, our client testimonials, the Wall Street Journal article that called us the future of logistics management. But what would be the point? These guys had already decided who I was the moment Harold introduced me. I was the warehouse guy, the son-in-law who'd failed to live up to the Lansing family standards. The disappointing narrative they needed to feel better about their own children's accomplishments. One of Harold's buddies, a guy with silver hair and a tie that probably cost more than my car payment, clapped me on the shoulder with that condescending familiarity that successful men use when they want to seem down to earth. "Honest work," he said, nodding sagely like he'd just imparted some deep wisdom. "Someone's got to keep the economy moving, right? Can't all be CEOs." The irony was so thick I could have cut it with one of Morton's overpriced steak knives, but I just smiled and nodded. "Right," I agreed. "Can't all be CEOs." I caught Sophie's eye across the room, and she looked like she was on the verge of a panic attack, probably imagining all the ways this dinner could go catastrophically wrong. Little did she know, we hadn't even gotten to the good part yet. Harold gestured toward the massive dining table that dominated the private room. It was set with enough silverware to confuse an etiquette expert and wine glasses that looked like they'd shatter if you breathed on them wrong. "Let's sit," he announced. "We have much to discuss. Business, opportunities, the market." Of course, business. Because that's what successful men do. They gather in expensive steakhouses and discuss the market like it's some mystical entity that only they have the wisdom to understand. I took my seat at the table, right between a guy who wouldn't stop talking about his Tesla and another guy who kept checking his phone like he was expecting a call from the president. Sophie sat across from me, shooting me warning looks that clearly said, "Please, for the love of God, just get through this dinner without starting a war." But here's the thing about being underestimated. It gives you options. I could sit here quietly, let them talk about their golf handicaps and their stock portfolios, nod along like a good little warehouse worker who was grateful to be in the presence of such successful men. Or I could wait. Just wait for the perfect moment. Because I knew something they didn't know. Something that was going to make this the most entertaining dinner Harold Lansing had ever hosted. And as I picked up my menu, pretending to care about the difference between a 12-ounce filet and a 16-ounce ribeye, I couldn't help but smile. This was going to be fun. If you've ever wondered what hell sounds like, let me paint you a picture. It's a table full of middle-aged businessmen trying to one-up each other about their golf handicaps, while simultaneously pretending they understand cryptocurrency. The conversation started the moment our asses hit the overpriced leather chairs, and it was exactly the kind of verbal peacocking you'd expect from men who measure their self-worth in stock portfolios and country club memberships. First up was Gerald, a guy whose hairline had retreated faster than the French army, but who compensated with enough confidence to power a small city. He launched into this absolutely riveting story about how he'd shot a birdie on the 7th hole at Pebble Beach, and I swear to God, he described that golf shot with more passion than most people describe their children's births. "The wind was coming in from the northwest," Gerald said, moving his hands like he was conducting an orchestra of invisible golf clubs. And I just knew, that if I could get the right arc on my swing, I could clear the bunker and land within 10 feet of the pin. Everyone around the table nodded like he'd just explained the cure for cancer instead of describing hitting a tiny ball with a stick. Harold was eating it up, chuckling and asking follow-up questions about club selection like it mattered, like Gerald's choice between a 7-iron and an 8-iron was going to change the trajectory of world events. I sat there, trying to figure out if this was real life or some elaborate prank show where I was the unwitting star. Then Richard, oh God, Richard, decided it was his turn to contribute to the conversation, and naturally, he steered it toward his Tesla. Because of course he did. Every person who owns a Tesla has this uncontrollable urge to tell you about their Tesla within the first 5 minutes of meeting them. It's like a medical condition. "You know," Richard said, leaning back in his chair with the smugness of someone who thinks driving an electric car makes them morally superior. "My Model S basically drives itself. I was going 75 on the highway yesterday, completely hands-free. It's basically a spaceship. A spaceship. This man just compared his car to a vehicle designed for space travel because it had lane-keeping assistance. I wanted to ask him if his spaceship also came with cup holders and a disappointing resale value, but I bit my tongue. The conversation ping-ponged between these riveting topics, stocks, specifically which ones they were buying and selling like they were day trading geniuses instead of guys with financial advisors doing all the actual work. Someone brought up the market, which is code for, "I'm going to pretend I understand complex economic systems by making vague statements that sound smart." One guy, I think his name was Preston or Prescott or something equally waspy, actually said with a straight face, "The market's looking bullish, but you have to watch for corrections." Wow, what insight, what wisdom. Someone get this man a Nobel Prize in stating the obvious. I glanced at Sophie, who was doing her best impression of someone who found this conversation absolutely fascinating, nodding along and smiling at appropriate intervals like she'd been trained for this her entire life. Which, let's be honest, she probably had been. Meanwhile, my phone was buzzing in my pocket like an angry hornet, and I knew exactly what it was. Mason, my CTO and the guy who actually understood what our company did, was sending me updates about our deployment. We had 50 new distribution centers going live tonight, 50 facilities across 12 states, all integrating with our software simultaneously. This was the kind of operation that required precise coordination, real-time monitoring, and the kind of technical expertise that would make these guys' heads spin. But sure, let's talk about golf handicaps and self-driving cars instead. I pulled out my phone as discreetly as possible, trying to check the deployment status without drawing too much attention. The last update from Mason read, Center 23 experiencing minor latency issues. Debugging now. Should be resolved in 15 minutes. Minor latency issues. Standard stuff. Nothing I needed to panic about, but definitely something I wanted to keep an eye on. That's when Harold's disapproving voice cut through my concentration like a knife through butter. Noah, can you not play Candy Crush at the table? The entire table went quiet. Everyone turned to look at me like I'd just pulled out a flask and started doing shots. I looked up from my phone, meeting Harold's judgmental gaze with the patience of a saint. I'm working, I said simply because I was. I was literally managing a multi-million-dollar deployment while these guys discussed their golf swings. But Harold wasn't having it. He did this dismissive hand-wave thing, like he was swatting away a fly or my entire career. Oh, right, he said with a chuckle that made my blood pressure spike. Managing forklifts from your phone. The table erupted in polite laughter, the kind that's designed to make you feel small without being overtly cruel. Lydia, because she apparently hadn't embarrassed me enough earlier, decided to pile on. She took a sip of her wine. Her third glass, not that I was counting, except I totally was, and smirked at me with the kind of malicious glee that only siblings and siblings-in-law can achieve. He's really passionate about his little project, she said, emphasizing little project, like she was talking about a child's lemonade stand or a hobby involving model trains. Sophie, sitting across from me looking like she wanted the earth to open up and swallow her whole, actually chuckled. She chuckled. My own wife, the woman who promised to love and support me in sickness and in health, just laughed along with her sister's condescending comment about my little project. Little project. That little project had hit a valuation of $1.2 billion that very morning. I'd gotten the email from our lead investor at Sequoia Capital at 6 a.m., and I'd been riding that high all day. $1.2 billion. With AB, our quarterly revenue was on track to hit $400 million. We had contracts with 3 of the top 5 national retailers in America. Fortune 500 companies were literally lining up to integrate our software into their operations. We'd been featured in TechCrunch, Bloomberg, The Wall Street Journal, and Forbes. We had job applications coming in from people with PhDs from MIT and Stanford, brilliant minds who wanted to work for my little project. But sure, let's reduce it to a cute hobby that I did in my spare time between managing imaginary forklifts. I put my phone face down on the table and smiled, that same calm smile I'd been wearing all night. Yeah, I said, my little project. It's pretty consuming. Richard, still riding high from his Tesla speech, decided to offer me some sage advice. You know, Noah, there's nothing wrong with warehouse work. It's honest labor. But have you ever thought about moving into management? Getting an MBA maybe? Harold could probably get you into Columbia. The condescension was so thick I could have spread it on toast. Here was a guy who'd probably inherited his father's company, giving me career advice like I was some lost puppy who needed guidance. An MBA? Sure. Because what my billion-dollar company really needed was for me to take 2 years off and learn about synergy and paradigm shifts from professors who'd never built anything in their lives. I appreciate the suggestion, I said, and I meant it in the same way you appreciate someone telling you your fly is down. Technically helpful information delivered in the most embarrassing way possible. But I'm pretty happy with where I am. Harold jumped in, because of course he did. Noah's content with his situation, he explained to the table, like I wasn't sitting right there. Not everyone needs to be ambitious. Some people are just happy with steady work. Steady work. Right. Because managing a company that was growing at 200% year over year was just steady work. I wondered what Harold would consider ambitious. Maybe if I cured cancer while simultaneously solving world hunger? Even then, he'd probably ask why I wasn't wearing a tie. The waiter arrived with our appetizers, and I'd never been so grateful for a distraction in my life. Shrimp cocktail, oysters, some kind of fancy salad that cost $30 and consisted mostly of air and arugula. Everyone dove in. the conversation shifting mercifully away from me and towards some discussion about real estate investments in the Hamptons. I took the opportunity to check my phone again, shielding the screen with my hand like a teenager hiding their text messages from their parents. Mason's latest update: latency issues resolved. All 50 centers operational. Deployment success rate: 98.7%. I smiled at that. 98.7%. In the tech world, that was basically a perfect score. But I couldn't celebrate, couldn't share this victory with anyone at this table because they wouldn't understand. They wouldn't get why I was grinning at my phone, why this mattered, why managing a successful deployment of this scale was a bigger achievement than any golf shot or stock trade they discussed all night. So I just sat there, eating my overpriced shrimp cocktail, listening to Gerald describe his vacation home in Martha's Vineyard with the same enthusiasm most people reserve for their firstborn children, and I waited. Because I knew something was coming. I could feel it in my bones, that perfect storm of karma and coincidence that was about to make this the most memorable dinner Harold Lansing had ever hosted. And when it hit, oh man, it was going to be spectacular. The main courses arrived with all the ceremony of a royal coronation. Massive steaks that probably required their own zip code, lobster tails the size of small dogs, and side dishes that cost more than most people's monthly utility bills. The waiters moved around our table like they were performing surgery, placing each plate with the kind of precision usually reserved for defusing bombs. Everyone made the appropriate appreciative noises, because apparently when you pay $75 for a piece of meat, you're obligated to act like you've just witnessed a miracle. Gerald actually moaned when he cut into his ribeye, which was both unsettling and exactly the kind of performance I'd come to expect from this crowd. I was halfway through my filet mignon, which, for the record, was pretty damn good, even if it did cost more than my first car, when Robert Crane decided to take an interest in me. Robert was different from the other guys at the table. He was younger, maybe early 40s, and he had this sharp, analytical look in his eyes that suggested he actually paid attention to things instead of just waiting for his turn to talk. He'd been quiet most of the dinner, observing more than participating, which immediately made him the most tolerable person in the room besides me. He set down his fork, wiped his mouth with his napkin like he was preparing for something important, and turned to me with genuine curiosity. "So, Noah," he said, and I braced myself for another condescending question about warehouse management or forklift certification. "What exactly do you do at the warehouse?" His tone was polite, professionally interested, the kind of question you ask at networking events when you're trying to figure out if someone is worth talking to, or if you should excuse yourself to grab another drink. Before I could even open my mouth to answer, before I could explain what I actually did for a living, Harold swooped in like a vulture spotting roadkill. "He helps move boxes," Harold announced to the table, and I swear he said it with the same tone you'd use to say he picks up trash on the highway, or he's still trying to figure out what he wants to be when he grows up. Harold continued, warming to his topic like a professor giving a lecture on disappointment. "Not glamorous, but hey, someone's got to do it." The patronizing smile on his face was absolutely magnificent in its condescension. He looked so pleased with himself, so satisfied with this explanation of my life's work. I could see it in his expression, the pride of a man who'd just successfully explained why his son-in-law was basically a blue-collar worker with delusions of grandeur. Someone's got to do it. Like I was some kind of necessary evil, a cog in the machine of commerce that existed solely to make sure rich people got their Amazon packages on time. I felt Sophie's foot tap mine under the table, a warning, a plea, a desperate message that translated to "Please don't make a scene, please don't embarrass me, please just let this go." But Robert wasn't done. He tilted his head slightly, studying me with those sharp eyes, and I could see the wheels turning in his brain. "And what's your company called?" Robert asked, directing the question at me this time, not Harold. It was such a simple question, so straightforward, but it carried weight. Because the question itself implied something that Harold had conveniently ignored, that I had a company. Not just a job, not just a position, but a company. My company. I paused for a moment, letting the silence stretch just long enough to be noticeable, and then I said it. Flowgrid Systems. I kept my voice casual, like it was no big deal, like I was just stating a fact as mundane as my eye color or shoe size. But I watched Robert's face carefully, looking for any flicker of recognition, any sign that the name meant something to him. And there it was. His eyes widened slightly, just a fraction, but enough that I noticed. His hand, which had been reaching for his wine glass, stopped mid-motion. For exactly 3 seconds, Robert Crane sat completely still, processing what I'd just said like a computer that had encountered an unexpected error. Then, moving with the deliberate slowness of someone who couldn't quite believe what they were doing, he pulled out his phone. The rest of the table was still talking, still engaged in their discussion about whether the Dow Jones was going to hit 40,000 or whatever arbitrary number made them feel smart, completely oblivious to the fact that everything was about to change. Robert's thumbs moved across his screen, typing with the focused intensity of someone searching for something specific. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was Googling my company. He was fact-checking me. And I loved it. I watched his face go through the most beautiful transformation. First confusion, his eyebrows scrunched together as he stared at his screen. Then recognition, his eyes going wide as he read whatever he was seeing. Then shock, his mouth opening slightly in surprise. And finally, disbelief, as he looked up from his phone to stare at me like I'd just told him I was actually a prince from a small European country who'd been living undercover as a commoner. The Flowgrid systems? Robert said, and his voice had completely changed. Gone was the polite professional interest. This was something else entirely. Respect, surprise, maybe even a little awe. The logistics optimization platform? Harold, who'd been in the middle of explaining to Preston why the Fed's interest rate policy was flawed, stopped mid-sentence. "What's that?" he asked, looking between Robert and me with confusion. Robert ignored him, his attention laser-focused on me now. "Your company just signed with Titan Distribution, right?" He was still staring at his phone, scrolling through what I assumed was our press release, or maybe our Wikipedia page, or one of the dozen articles that had been written about us in the past 6 months. My firm was in that acquisition deal. He looked up at me, really looked at me, seeing me for the first time all night. "You're the CEO?" The question hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. I could feel the attention of the entire table shifting toward our conversation, could sense the other men tuning out their own discussions to listen to this one. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral, like we were discussing the weather or the quality of the breadbasket. "Founder and CEO," I confirmed. "But don't worry, I still move boxes sometimes." Virtually. I added that last part with a smile, a tiny little jab at Harold's earlier explanation of my job responsibilities. Robert let out a laugh. Not the polite, performative chuckle that had been floating around the table all night, but a genuine, surprised bark of laughter that made several other people jump slightly. "Holy shit," Robert said, then immediately looked apologetic for swearing at the dinner table like we were in church instead of a steakhouse. But he couldn't help himself. He was staring at me like I'd just performed a magic trick, like I'd pulled a rabbit out of a hat, except the rabbit was a billion-dollar company, and the hat was Harold's crushing disappointment. The whole table had gone silent now. That particular kind of silence that falls when something significant is happening and everyone can sense it, but no one quite understands it yet. Gerald had stopped mid-chew, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth. Preston was looking between Robert and me with confusion. Richard had actually put down his phone, which was probably the first time all night he hadn't been checking his Tesla's battery status, or whatever it is Tesla owners obsessively monitor. Harold's face was doing something fascinating. It was cycling through expressions so quickly I could barely keep track. Confusion, skepticism, concern, and something that might have been the first stirrings of dread. "Robert," Harold said slowly, carefully, like he was talking to someone who might be having a mental breakdown. "What are you talking about?" Robert turned to look at Harold, and I could see him trying to figure out how to explain this without making Harold look like a complete idiot. Spoiler alert, there was no way to do that. The situation was what it was. Harold had spent the entire dinner introducing his son-in-law as basically a warehouse janitor, and that warehouse janitor was actually a tech CEO whose company was worth more than everyone at this table combined probably made in a year. "Harold," Robert said, and I could hear him choosing his words carefully. "Flowgrid Systems is one of the most successful logistics tech companies in the country. They just completed a Series C funding round that valued them at over $1 billion. He paused, letting that sink in. "Noah's company is revolutionizing supply chain management. We've been trying to get them to work with our firm for 6 months. The silence that followed was so complete, so absolute, that I could hear the kitchen staff clattering dishes 2 rooms away. Every single person at that table was staring at me now, and the expressions ranged from shocked to confused too. In Lydia's case, absolutely horrified. Sophie's face had gone completely pale, her wine glass frozen halfway to her lips, her eyes so wide I worried about her eyelids cramping. Harold opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again like a fish gasping for air. $1 billion, he started, then trailed off, unable to complete the sentence. Dollars, I finished helpfully. With AB, though technically we hit 1.2 billion this morning, so really we should probably round up. I took a sip of my water, perfectly calm, while the table processed this information. Lydia looked like she was going to be sick, actually physically ill. Her face had gone from its usual confident smugness to something resembling existential crisis. I could practically see her rewinding every condescending comment she'd made tonight, every dismissive laugh, every eye roll. But you, Harold started, then stopped again. He was having trouble with complete sentences, which was understandable. His entire worldview was currently being dismantled in real time. I drive a Honda? I offered. Yeah, it's paid off, and it gets great gas mileage. Crazy, right? The sarcasm was probably unnecessary, but I'd earned it. I'd earned every single drop of it after sitting through this entire dinner being treated like I'd barely graduated high school. Robert was grinning now, full-on grinning like he'd just watched the best plot twist in a movie. He looked at his phone again, scrolling through more information. You're 29, he said, reading from what was probably my Wikipedia page or LinkedIn profile. You founded the company 5 years ago. You have contracts with, he scrolled, Jesus, basically everyone. Walmart, Target, Amazon, Costco. He looked up at me with something approaching respect. How the hell did Harold not know about this? That was the million-dollar question, wasn't it? Or in this case, the billion-dollar question. I glanced at Sophie, who looked like she was mentally preparing her apology speech, then at Harold, who looked like he'd just discovered his warehouse worker son-in-law was actually Bruce Wayne. I tried to mention it once or twice, I said mildly, but someone kept calling it my warehouse thing. So I figured why bother? And that, my friends, is what we call a mic drop moment. You know how in movies, there's always that perfectly timed moment where something happens that's so perfectly coincidental, it seems completely unrealistic? Like the hero is about to prove their point, and then boom. Exactly the evidence they need just magically appears? Yeah, I always thought that was Hollywood BS. The kind of convenient plot device that only works in fiction because real life is messy and timing is never that perfect. Turns out I was wrong. Because at the exact moment that Robert Crane had just finished explaining to the table that I was actually a billionaire CEO and not a forklift enthusiast, the universe decided to deliver the most spectacular mic drop in the history of awkward family dinners. The TV in the corner of the private dining room, which had been playing some mindless sports recap that nobody was watching, suddenly switched channels. Now, I don't know if it was divine intervention, cosmic timing, or just some waiter in the back who got bored of basketball highlights, but that screen cut straight to Bloomberg Tech. And not just Bloomberg Tech in general. Oh no, that would be too subtle, too understated. Instead, the screen filled with the Bloomberg logo, followed by their crisp, professional anchor sitting at that iconic desk with the digital displays behind her showing stock tickers and market data. She had that serious but approachable expression that financial news anchors perfect, the one that says, I'm about to tell you something important, and you should probably pay attention. And now, the anchor said in that clear, authoritative voice that makes everything sound like breaking news even if she's just talking about quarterly earnings, we meet the tech world's newest billion-dollar CEO. I felt my stomach do a little flip, the kind you get right before a roller coaster drops, or right before you realize you're about to become the center of attention in a way you absolutely did not plan for. The screen transitioned from the anchor to B-roll footage, and there I was. Me, Noah Lansing, on Bloomberg Television, standing in front of Flowgrid's main operations hub with its massive digital displays showing real-time logistics data from distribution centers across North America. I was wearing, and this detail feels important, a black turtleneck and jeans. The same outfit I was currently wearing. The same outfit that Harold had looked at 2 hours ago with the kind of disappointment usually reserved for failed soufflés. The camera had caught me mid-explanation, gesturing toward one of the screens while our head of operations stood next to me nodding along. I remembered that interview. It had been 3 weeks ago, right after we'd announced our Series C funding. Bloomberg had wanted to do a feature on the new generation of tech founders, and somehow I'd made the cut. At the time, I'd been worried I'd said something stupid or that my hair looked weird. Now, watching it play in front of my father-in-law and his collection of judgmental business friends, I was just grateful I'd sounded relatively coherent and professional. The anchor's voice continued over the footage. At just 29 years old, Noah Lansing, founder of Flowgrid Systems, has redefined warehouse logistics, achieving a valuation of $1.3 billion. $1.3 billion. They must have updated their numbers since this morning. Our stock must have kept climbing after I'd checked it last. The sound of Sophie's wine glass hitting the table was so sharp it could have shattered crystal. I turned to look at her, and her face was doing this thing I'd never seen before. A combination of shock, confusion, pride, horror, and what might have been the dawning realization that she'd married someone she didn't actually know. Her mouth was open, literally hanging open, frozen mid-sip like someone had hit pause on her entire existence. The wine in her glass was sloshing dangerously close to the rim because her hand was shaking slightly. "That's," she started, but couldn't seem to finish the sentence. Her brain had apparently blue-screened. Harold was staring at the TV like it had personally betrayed him. He squinted at the screen, leaning forward slightly, like maybe if he looked hard enough the image would change, and it would turn out to be someone else, some other Noah Lansing who just happened to look exactly like his disappointing warehouse worker's son-in-law. "That looks like," he said slowly, his voice trailing off as his brain struggled to process what his eyes were seeing. The cognitive dissonance was almost beautiful to watch. On one hand, evidence. Clear, undeniable evidence broadcast on one of the most respected financial news networks in the world. On the other hand, his entire belief system about his son-in-law being a mediocre underachiever. Something had to give. "Yeah," I said, keeping my voice as casual as possible, like we were discussing the weather or commenting on the quality of the bread rolls. "I get that a lot. People say I have one of those faces." The sarcasm was probably lost on Harold, whose brain was still trying to reconcile reality with his expectations, but Robert caught it and actually snorted into his wine glass. On screen, Bloomberg was still going, because apparently the universe wasn't done twisting the knife. The anchor continued with my professional biography, rattling off achievements like she was reading a grocery list. Lansing founded Flowgrid 5 years ago after dropping out of Stanford's computer science program. The company now manages logistics operations for over 300 clients, including major retailers Walmart, Target, and Amazon. Stanford dropout. That was always fun to mention. Harold had given me so much grief about not finishing my degree, had literally told Sophie at our wedding that at least he tried college, like I'd failed out due to incompetence rather than leaving because I had a company to run and venture capitalists throwing money at me. The Bloomberg segment showed more footage. Our offices, which looked appropriately tech startup-ish with their open floor plans and standing desks, and that vintage Pac-Man machine we kept in the break room. There was a shot of our engineering team gathered around monitors, looking focused and professional. Another shot of one of our client distribution centers, massive and efficiently organized, with our software displayed prominently on screens throughout the facility. The company's proprietary algorithm, the anchor explained, and I could see some of the guys at the table actually leaning forward to listen, has reduced operational costs for clients by an average of 32%, while improving delivery times by up to 40%. She said it like it was simple, like we'd just stumbled upon this solution accidentally, but I knew the reality. That algorithm had taken 18 months of development, thousands of hours of testing, and more failed iterations than I could count. We'd basically taught computers to think like the world's most efficient warehouse manager, except without the need for coffee breaks or bathroom stops. Robert had his phone out now. Recording the TV screen like this was evidence he needed to preserve. Several other guys at the table had pulled out their phones too, probably Googling me, probably reading the same articles Robert had found, probably experiencing the same, oh shit, moment of realization. Gerald was just staring, his mouth slightly open, his ribeye forgotten. Preston had put down his fork and was watching the screen with the kind of attention usually reserved for Super Bowl commercials or your doctor delivering test results. Even Richard had stopped thinking about his Tesla long enough to focus on this revelation. The Bloomberg anchor transitioned to talking about our funding rounds, and this was where it got really good. Flowgrid has raised over $90 million from top-tier venture capital firms, including Sequoia Capital, Andreessen Horowitz, and Benchmark. She listed them like she was reading off an honor roll, and I could see the recognition in the eyes of the guys at the table. These weren't just random investors. These were the investors, the ones that every startup founder dreams about. The firms that had backed Google, Facebook, Uber, Airbnb. The ones with the Midas touch. And they'd bet on me. On my warehouse thing. Recent reports, the anchor continued, and I braced myself because I knew what was coming next, indicate that Flowgrid is in talks for a potential acquisition by Microsoft, with preliminary valuations exceeding $2 billion. Okay, so that part wasn't actually confirmed yet. We were in preliminary discussions, very preliminary, the kind of early-stage conversations where everyone's just feeling each other out and nothing's certain. But Bloomberg had gotten wind of it somehow, probably from the same source that had leaked half the other tech acquisitions in the past year, and they'd run with it. $2 billion. With a B. Again with the B. That letter was doing a lot of heavy lifting tonight. Harold made a sound that I can only describe as a strangled gasp, like someone had punched him in the stomach and he was trying not to show it. He turned to look at me, really look at me, and I could see him reassessing everything. Every conversation we'd ever had. Every dismissive comment. Every time he'd introduced me as the warehouse guy or suggested I needed to find a real job. All of it was being recontextualized in real time, and the expression on his face suggested the realization was not comfortable. Lydia, bless her judgmental heart, looked like she was going through the 7 stages of grief simultaneously. Her face had gone from smug to shocked to horrified to something that might have been respect, but looked more like she was trying not to throw up her expensive dinner. Sophie was still frozen, her wine glass still suspended in midair, her eyes moving between the TV screen and my face like she was watching a tennis match. I caught her eye and gave her a little shrug, like, surprise, honey, your husband isn't actually a failure. She looked like she wanted to say something, probably something along the lines of, why didn't you tell me, or how did I not know this? But the words weren't coming. Her mouth opened and closed a few times, but no sound emerged. It was like watching a computer try to boot up after a major system crash. The Bloomberg segment wrapped up with one final shot of me standing in front of our logo, looking reasonably professional and sea-alike, while the anchor delivered her closing line. At an age when most people are still paying off student loans, Noah Lansing has built an empire, one optimized warehouse at a time. The screen transitioned to a commercial for some investment firm, and the spell broke. Everyone at the table seemed to exhale at once, like they'd been holding their breath for the entire segment. The silence that followed was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. Nobody was eating. Nobody was drinking. Everyone was just sitting there, processing, trying to figure out what the hell they were supposed to say. And me? I just picked up my fork and went back to my steak, which had gotten slightly cold during all the excitement, but was still pretty damn good. So, I set into the silence, cutting another piece of meat with deliberate casualness. Anyone else want to tell me about their golf handicap? I was really enjoying those stories. Robert was the first one to break the silence, and God bless him for it, because the tension in that room was thick enough to require a machete. He let out this laugh, not the polite, restrained chuckle that business dinners require, but a full-throated, genuine belly laugh that echoed off the wood-paneled walls. He slapped the table hard enough to make the silverware jump and turned to Sophie with this absolutely gleeful expression. "You're joking, right?" he said, pointing between her and me like we were some elaborate prank. "You're married to the Flowgrid guy?" The way he said it made it sound like I was some kind of celebrity, which I guess in the tech and logistics world, I kind of was. But hearing it out loud, in front of my wife who'd just spent the last 2 hours apologizing for my existence, was particularly satisfying. Sophie's mouth was still doing that fish-out-of-water thing, opening and closing without producing actual words. Finally, she managed to stammer out, well, he never said it was that big. The defense was weak, and we both knew it. I tried to tell her about the company, multiple times, but every time I brought up Flowgrid, she'd gotten this glazed look in her eyes, the same expression people get when you try to explain cryptocurrency or the plot of a Christopher Nolan movie. She'd pat my hand and say something like, "That's nice, honey," before changing the subject to something she actually cared about, like her book club or whether we should repaint the living room. And when her family asked what I did, she'd just say something with warehouses, because that was easier than trying to understand or explain the actual complexity of supply chain optimization software. I leaned back in my chair, absolutely savoring this moment, and looked at Sophie with the kind of loving exasperation that only comes from being married to someone who doesn't listen. "Sweetheart," I said, keeping my voice gentle but loaded with just enough sarcasm to make my point. "You told me not to embarrass you tonight." Mission accomplished. The irony was beautiful. She'd been so worried about me embarrassing her by being too casual, too unprofessional, too much of a disappointment in front of her father's successful friends. And now here we were, with her being embarrassed for completely different reasons. Mainly that she'd been married to a billionaire CEO for 2 years and somehow never bothered to figure that out. Harold's friend Peter, who'd been quiet most of the night probably because he was the only one smart enough to realize he didn't know everything, was furiously scrolling through his phone. His eyes were scanning the screen with the intensity of someone cramming for a final exam. "Bloomberg says you raised $50 million from Sequoia," he said, looking up at me with something approaching awe. "Sequoia Capital. Just saying that name in tech circles is like dropping the mic. They'd backed Apple, Google, YouTube, Instagram, basically every company that had ever mattered. And they'd backed us. They'd taken one look at our pitch deck, our metrics, our vision, and they'd written a check so big it had made my hands shake when I deposited it." "Yep," I confirmed, taking a sip of water like we were discussing the weather. "They insisted on paying for dinner after the deal closed, but I told them I had steak plans. It was a joke, obviously, but the table didn't know how to react. Was I being serious? Was I actually that casual about turning down dinner with one of the most prestigious VC firms in the world? The answer was no. I'd absolutely had dinner with them, but the confused looks on their faces were worth the little white lie. Lydia, who'd been suspiciously quiet since the Bloomberg revelation, finally found her voice. She was still gripping her wine glass like it was a life preserver, and her face had this pinched quality that suggested she was doing complex mental math about every condescending comment she'd made in the past 2 hours. "You never mentioned any of this," she said, and there was accusation in her voice, like somehow this was my fault. Like I'd deliberately hidden my success just to make her look bad, rather than the reality which was that nobody had ever bothered to ask or listen. I set down my fork and looked at her directly, letting the moment breathe. Every time I did, someone called it my warehouse job. I replied, keeping my tone even and factual. It wasn't angry. It wasn't bitter. It was just true. And the truth, as they say, hurts like a son of a bitch. I could see the realization hitting her, the memories flooding back of all the times she'd dismissed me, rolled her eyes, made little comments about my cute little project or my warehouse thing. Robert was still grinning like a kid on Christmas morning. He'd pulled up our company website on his phone and was scrolling through it with genuine interest. "Classic," he said, shaking his head with admiration. "This is absolutely classic. You've been sitting here all night letting Harold introduce you as a warehouse worker while you're actually—" He checked his phone again. Forbes 30 under 30, TechCrunch headline, Wall Street Journal front page. He looked at me with new respect. How did they not know? It was a fair question. How does someone's family not know they're successful? But the answer was simpler than people wanted to admit, because they never asked. Because they'd made assumptions based on how I dressed and where I didn't work, and those assumptions were more comfortable than the truth. Gerald had finally recovered enough to speak, though he looked like someone had just explained to him that his golf trophy was actually plastic. "Wall Street Journal?" he repeated weakly. "You were in the Wall Street Journal?" I nodded. "Front page of the business section, actually. They did this whole piece on how we're disrupting traditional logistics models. It was pretty cool. My mom bought like 15 copies. That detail seemed to humanize me somehow, and I saw a few guys smile at that. Because at the end of the day, no matter how successful you are, your mom is still your mom, and she's still going to brag about you to everyone at her book club." The table had completely transformed. Gone were the condescending smiles and the polite dismissals. Now everyone was looking at me like I was a different person entirely, which was hilarious because I was literally the same guy who'd walked in 2 hours ago. Same jeans, same turtleneck, same face. The only thing that had changed was their perception, and watching that shift in real time was more satisfying than any steak Morton's could serve. Harold looked like he'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. His confident, dismissive demeanor had crumbled, replaced by something that looked uncomfortably like regret mixed with panic. And the night was still young. The universe, apparently deciding that one cosmic coincidence wasn't enough for the evening, delivered round two right on schedule. Harold's phone, one of those obnoxiously expensive smartphones that he was always bragging about having the latest model of, started buzzing on the table with that aggressive vibration that suggests someone really, really needs to talk to you right now. He glanced down at the screen, and I watched his face do something fascinating. It went from confusion to recognition to what I can only describe as pure, unfiltered panic. The kind of expression you get when you realize you've made a terrible mistake and the bill is about to come due. "It's Charles," Harold muttered, more to himself than to anyone at the table, staring at his phone like it had just grown teeth. "Charles from Columbia Business School." He said it with the kind of reverence people usually reserve for religious figures or celebrities, and I knew exactly who he was talking about. Charles Whitmore, Dean of Columbia Business School, one of the most prestigious business programs in the country, and coincidentally, someone I'd had several very pleasant conversations with over the past 6 months. Harold answered the call, holding up one finger to the table in that universal gesture of, "Give me a minute. This is important." He stepped away from the table slightly, pressing the phone to his ear, and I could hear his side of the conversation even though he was trying to be discreet. "Charles, good to hear from you. What's— Yes, I'm at dinner right now. What? Oh yes, Noah's right here." Harold's eyes snapped to me, wide with something between confusion and dawning horror. "Your donation?" His voice went up at the end, turning it into a question, like maybe he'd misheard, like maybe Charles was talking about a different Noah. "Confirm the— Yes, he's my son-in-law." "Wait, what donation are we talking about exactly?" I took another bite of my steak, chewing slowly, watching Harold's face cycle through expressions like a slot machine. This was even better than I'd imagined. I'd made the donation to Columbia 3 months ago, specifically to their entrepreneurship program, because I'd wanted to give back to the business school community and help fund resources for students trying to start their own companies. Columbia had been my second choice for business school before I decided to drop out of Stanford entirely and focus on Flowgrid. The donation had been substantial. Okay, very substantial, but I'd done it quietly, without fanfare, because that's how I preferred to handle my charitable giving. Harold's hand was shaking slightly as he held the phone. $1.2 million, he said, his voice strangled, like someone was physically squeezing his throat. "For the entrepreneurship grant program?" "I see. No, of course we'll confirm." "Yes, thank you, Charles. We'll talk soon." He ended the call and just stood there for a moment, phone in hand, staring into the middle distance like he was having an out-of-body experience. The table had gone silent again. Apparently, we were making a habit of these dramatic pauses, and everyone was watching Harold's meltdown with the kind of morbid fascination usually reserved for car accidents or reality TV. Lydia, who'd been taking a long drink of wine probably to cope with the evening's revelations, actually choked. Like, full-on sputtered and coughed, wine probably going down the wrong pipe. "You donated $1 million?" she gasped out between coughs, her eyes watering. Her makeup, which had been perfect earlier, was starting to run slightly from the coughing-induced tears, and I'd never seen her look less composed. It was glorious. Technically 1.2. I corrected, because accuracy matters. But who's counting? I shrugged like we were talking about donating $20 to a GoFundMe, not over $1 million to one of the country's top business schools. Columbia is doing great work with their entrepreneurship program. They needed funding for student resources, mentorship programs, startup seed money. It felt like the right thing to do. Robert had gone back to his phone, scrolling with increased fervor, and he let out a low whistle. "Dude," he said, and the casualness of the word dude at this formal business dinner somehow made it more impactful. "Your Forbes 30 under 30, TechCrunch headline, Wall Street Journal front page. How did they not know?" He gestured around the table, indicating the collective ignorance of my in-laws and their business associates. It was a question I'd been asking myself for years, honestly. How do you live with someone, be married to someone, be related to someone, and not know basic facts about their life? The answer, I'd learned, was simple. You don't ask. You make assumptions, and then you never bother to check if those assumptions are correct. Family group chats are complicated, I said with a half smile, which was the understatement of the century. Our family group chat was a wasteland of ignored messages and changed subjects. Anytime I tried to share news about Flowgrid, a new funding round, a major client, an industry award, the conversation would immediately pivot to something else. Sophie's mom would post a picture of her cat. Lydia would ask about restaurant recommendations. Harold would share some article about the stock market. It was like my messages existed in a parallel dimension that nobody else could see. After a while, I just stopped trying. What was the point of sharing your achievements with people who'd already decided you weren't achieving anything worth noting? Suddenly, Harold stood up from his position near the wall where he'd taken the call. He cleared his throat with the kind of theatrical formality that suggested he was about to make a speech. And oh boy, was I ready for this. The entire table turned to look at him, forks paused mid-bite, wine glasses frozen in midair. Everyone, Harold began, his voice carrying that forced joviality of someone trying to save face after a catastrophic error in judgment. I owe my son-in-law an apology. The words looked like they physically pained him to say, like each syllable was a small knife wound. Turns out he's not just a warehouse worker. He paused for what I assume he thought was dramatic effect. He owns the warehouses. It was such a Harold thing to say. Even in his apology, he had to make it about ownership, about possession, about the metrics of success he understood. I could have let it slide, could have just nodded and accepted the apology gracefully, but where's the fun in that? Technically the software that runs them. I corrected, keeping my tone light and educational. But close enough. It was a small correction, but an important one. I didn't own warehouses. That would make me a real estate mogul. I owned the technology that made warehouses run efficiently, that saved companies millions of dollars, that revolutionized how products moved from manufacturers to consumers. The distinction mattered, at least to me. Preston, who'd been quiet for most of the dinner but was apparently now feeling brave enough to speak up, leaned forward with his elbows on the table. So the Bloomberg segment said you're in acquisition talks with Microsoft? It was phrased as a question, but it was really a request for confirmation, for validation, for more details about something so massive it probably kept him up at night just thinking about it. I nodded slowly, because yes, we were in talks with Microsoft, but those talks were preliminary and confidential and definitely not something I should be discussing at a dinner table with people I barely knew. But the cat was already out of the bag, scratching up the furniture and knocking over expensive vases. Early stages, I said, choosing my words carefully. They're interested in integrating our logistics platform with their Azure cloud services. Would be a good fit for both companies. I didn't mention the proposed acquisition price because even I had limits to my pettiness, and also because those numbers weren't finalized and sharing them could potentially violate about 17 different NDAs I'd signed. But the implication was clear. Microsoft, one of the largest tech companies in the world, wanted to buy my little warehouse project. Richard, the Tesla guy who'd been mercifully quiet since the Bloomberg revelation, suddenly perked up. Wait, so you're going to sell? He asked, and there was genuine curiosity in his voice now, not the condescension from earlier. Thinking about it, I admitted. But it's complicated. Would depend on the terms, what happens to my team, whether we can maintain our company culture. It's not just about the money. The irony of me saying, it's not just about the money, to a table full of people who'd spent the entire dinner talking about nothing, but money wasn't lost on me. Gerald looked like he wanted to ask a question, but couldn't quite figure out how to phrase it without sounding stupid. Peter was still scrolling through his phone, probably reading every article ever written about Flowgrid, trying to catch up on 2 years of tech news he'd apparently missed. And Harold just stood there, looking at me like he was seeing me for the first time, really seeing me, and realizing that maybe, just maybe, he'd completely misjudged his son-in-law. Sophie finally found her voice, though it came out smaller than usual. Noah, why didn't you tell me it was this big? It was a fair question, and I could hear the hurt underneath it, the confusion of someone realizing they'd been living with a stranger. I looked at her, my wife, the woman I loved despite her occasional inability to listen, and I softened slightly. I tried soft, I said gently. But every time I brought it up, someone in your family called it my warehouse thing, and you'd change the subject. After a while, I just stopped trying. The truth of that statement hung in the air, uncomfortable and undeniable, and I watched her process it, watched her realize that maybe she bore some responsibility for not knowing about her own husband's life. Dinner wrapped up with all the awkwardness of a high school reunion where everyone's pretending they're more successful than they actually are, except in reverse. The guys who'd spent the entire evening peacocking about their golf games and stock portfolios were now trying to subtly ask me for business cards, investment opportunities, or just to pick my brain sometime, which is code for please give me free consulting. I handed out exactly 0 business cards because I'm not an idiot and I know what "let's grab coffee sometime" really means when it comes from people who ignored you for 2 hours straight. The meal ended with an uncomfortable amount of handshaking and backslapping, with everyone suddenly treating me like I was their long-lost best friend instead of the warehouse guy they'd been patronizing all evening. Sophie had gone quiet, which was concerning because my wife was many things but quiet was rarely one of them. She sat in the passenger seat of our Honda Civic. Yes, the same Honda Civic that I'd driven to a billion-dollar business dinner, staring out the window like she was processing the meaning of life or trying to figure out how she'd married a stranger. I was about to start the car and escape this nightmare of a parking lot when I heard footsteps approaching. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that belonged to someone who decided they needed to have a talk. I already knew who it was before I looked up. Harold's face appeared at my window, slightly red from the wine and the embarrassment, and he made that universal hand-rolling gesture that means, roll down your window, we need to talk. I sighed, pressed the button to lower the window, and prepared myself for whatever version of reconciliation or damage control Harold was about to attempt. He stood there for a moment, looking at my car with the kind of expression usually reserved for observing a historical artifact in a museum. "You really drive a Honda?" he asked, and there was genuine confusion in his voice, like he'd just discovered I lived in a cardboard box or ate ramen for every meal. It wasn't judgment exactly, more like bewilderment that someone with my net worth would choose to drive a vehicle that cost less than his monthly country club dues. "Yeah," I confirmed, patting the dashboard affectionately. "It runs. Unlike your investments in crypto last year." Okay, so that was a low blow. But Harold had spent last Thanksgiving explaining to the entire family how he was getting in early on some cryptocurrency that was definitely going to be the next Bitcoin, and then proceeded to lose about $40,000 when it turned out to be a scam run by a guy in his mom's basement. I tried to warn him. I'd sent him articles. I'd explained the red flags. But Harold had that special kind of confidence that comes from being successful in one field and assuming it translates to every other field, so he'd ignored me. The crypto had crashed, Harold had never mentioned it again, and I'd filed that information away for future use. Future use being right now, apparently. Harold's face did this complicated thing where he clearly wanted to be offended, but also knew he deserved that jab. He settled on a sort of resigned sigh, the sound of a man who'd lost the moral high ground and knew it. "Fair point," he admitted, which might have been the first time I'd ever heard him admit he was wrong about anything. "Look, Noah, He trailed off, searching for words, and I could see him struggling with the unfamiliar territory of eating humble pie. "Can I be honest with you? I almost laughed at that, as opposed to all the dishonesty so far, but I kept my face neutral and just nodded. "Sure, Harold. Honesty sounds great." He leaned against my car, my perfectly functional, paid-off Honda that had served me faithfully for 5 years, and looked up at the night sky like he was searching for divine guidance. "I thought you were a screw-up," he said bluntly, and wow. Okay, we were really going for honesty here. Sophie's my youngest daughter, and when she told me she was marrying some guy who worked in warehouses and dressed like a college student, I thought she was making a mistake. There it was. The truth I'd always suspected but he'd never actually voiced. Harold Lansing thought his daughter had married down. Thought she'd settled for some blue-collar worker who'd never amount to anything, who'd drag her down from the Lansing family's carefully cultivated social status. "I spent the last 2 years trying to help you," Harold continued, and I could hear the genuine conviction in his voice, which almost made it worse. "The networking dinners, the job suggestions, the introductions to people who might hire you. I thought I was being a good father-in-law. I thought I was giving you opportunities you couldn't get on your own. The road to hell, they say, is paved with good intentions, and Harold had apparently been speedrunning that journey. He genuinely believed he was helping me, saving me from my mediocre existence, when in reality he'd just been too arrogant to ask basic questions about what I actually did for a living. It would be funny if it wasn't so sad. And instead, I said, finishing his thought, you were being condescending to someone who didn't need your help. Harold nodded, looking more deflated than I'd ever seen him. Yeah, pretty much. He ran a hand through his silver hair, the same hair he probably spent a fortune maintaining at some upscale salon. I'm sorry, Noah. Really, I judged you without knowing anything about you, and I was wrong. It was a decent apology, all things considered. No excuses, no justifications, just an admission of wrongdoing. I could respect that, even if I was still annoyed about the 2 years of subtle insults and patronizing dinner conversations. I appreciate the apology, I said, and I meant it. But Harold, you could have just asked. At any point in the last 2 years, you could have asked me what I actually did instead of assuming. He winced at that, which was fair. You're right. I should have. You dress so casually, and you're so young, and you never talk about work at family dinners. Because every time I tried, someone changed the subject, I pointed out. And I dress casually because I work in tech. Have you seen what Mark Zuckerberg wears? Steve Jobs literally wore the same outfit every day. The turtleneck isn't a fashion choice, it's an industry standard. Harold actually smiled at that, a small, genuine smile. Fair enough. I suppose I'm old-fashioned. In my day, successful people wore suits. In your day, people also thought smoking was healthy and that the internet was a fad, I countered. Times change, Harold. He laughed at that, a real laugh, and some of the tension dissipated. They certainly do. He paused, seeming to gather courage for something. Noah, I know I don't have any right to ask this after tonight, but could I visit your office sometime? See what you've built. The request surprised me. I'd expected more apologies, maybe some awkward questions about my net worth or investment strategy, but not genuine interest in my work. You want to visit Flowgrid? I asked, just to make sure I'd heard him correctly. Yeah, Harold said, and he actually looked a little embarrassed. I'd like to understand what you do. Really understand it. Not just what I read on Bloomberg. I considered it for a moment. Part of me wanted to say no, wanted to make him suffer a little longer for the 2 years of dismissive comments and condescending introductions. But the bigger part of me, the part that actually liked teaching people about logistics optimization and supply chain management, was genuinely excited about the prospect. Sure, I said finally. But fair warning, it's a lot more interesting than it sounds. And you might actually learn something. I'm counting on it, Harold said. Then, with a slight smirk that reminded me he was still the same guy who'd survived decades in business, he added, should I wear steel-toed shoes? You know, for all the forklifts. Oh, he wanted to make jokes now? After everything? I grinned despite myself. Absolutely. We have forklifts everywhere. Virtual ones, mostly. But you can never be too careful. Harold laughed again, shaking his head. I deserve that. You really did, I agreed. He stepped back from my car, giving it one last puzzled look like he still couldn't quite reconcile my success with my choice of vehicle. You know, Noah, you could buy anything. A Mercedes, a Porsche, a mansion in the Hamptons. Why? I interrupted. My Honda starts every morning. Can't say the same about some people's yachts. I let that sink in because I knew for a fact that Harold had bought a yacht 2 years ago that spent more time in the shop than in the water. His face told me he got the reference. Touché, he said. Although in my defense, boats are notoriously temperamental. So I've heard, I said dryly. Along with crypto investments and assumptions about your son-in-law. Harold held up his hands in surrender. All right, I get it. I screwed up. Multiple times. Can we move past this? I thought about it for a moment, watching him stand there in the parking lot looking genuinely contrite, and I realized that yeah, we probably could. Holding grudges took energy, and I had better things to do with my time than stay mad at my father-in-law for being an out-of-touch snob. We can move past it, I agreed. But I'm never letting you forget the warehouse worker comment. That's going in my toast at the next family gathering. Harold groaned. Great. Something to look forward to. Oh, absolutely, I said cheerfully. I'm thinking PowerPoint presentation. Maybe some charts showing the correlation between assumptions and looking like an idiot. You're enjoying this too much, Harold said, but he was smiling. I really am, I admitted. It's been a therapeutic evening. He laughed, shook his head one more time, and stepped back from the car. Good night, Noah. Drive safe. And Thank you for being gracious about all this. Good night, Harold. See you at the office tour. I rolled up my window and finally started the car. Sophie, who'd been silent through the entire exchange, finally turned to look at me. That was nice of you, she said quietly, letting him visit the office. I shrugged, pulling out of the parking space. He's your dad. And honestly, I think seeing what we actually do will be good for him. Might expand his perspective a little. You mean humble him? Sophie said, a slight smile playing at her lips. Potato, potato. I replied, and she actually laughed. It was the first real laugh I'd heard from her all evening, and it felt good. The drive home was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. Not tense, just contemplative. And as I drove my perfectly functional Honda through the streets, I couldn't help but smile. Tonight had been exhausting, awkward, and deeply satisfying in equal measure. But it wasn't over yet. The moment I pulled into our driveway, my phone exploded. And I don't mean that figuratively. I mean it literally started buzzing so aggressively I thought it was having a seizure. Notifications were flooding in like a tsunami of digital chaos. Investors congratulating me on the Bloomberg feature, clients asking if the Microsoft acquisition rumors were true, journalists requesting interviews, LinkedIn connection requests from people I'd never heard of, and about 47 texts from people who suddenly remembered they knew me after seeing my face on financial television. It was overwhelming in that uniquely modern way where you're simultaneously flattered and exhausted by the attention. But scrolling through all of it, past the venture capitalists, past the Fortune 500 executives, past the reporters from TechCrunch and Forbes, there was only one message I actually cared about. Mason Chun, my CTO and the person who'd been with me since day one when Flowgrid was just an idea scribbled on a whiteboard in my apartment, had sent a text that made me grin like an idiot. Deployment complete. 0 errors. All centers online. Teams celebrating at Murphy's. Get your billionaire ass down here. Murphy's Bar was this dive about 3 blocks from our office. The kind of place that served beer in plastic cups and had peanut shells on the floor and absolutely zero pretension. It was the polar opposite of Morton's Steakhouse, and right now, that was exactly what I needed. I looked at Sophie, who was still processing the evening's revelations with the shell-shocked expression of someone who'd just discovered their spouse had a secret identity. I need to go check on the team, I said, already knowing what her response would be. She blinked at me, confusion crossing her face. Now? It's almost 10 o'clock. Yeah, we just completed a major deployment. 50 distribution centers went live tonight while I was eating overpriced steak and being insulted by your family. My team pulled it off perfectly, and they're celebrating. I should be there. I could see her wanting to argue, wanting to tell me to stay home so we could talk about everything that had happened tonight, process our feelings, maybe have a lengthy discussion about communication in our marriage. But something in my expression must have told her this wasn't negotiable. Okay, she said softly. Don't stay out too late. No promises, I replied, already changing out of my dinner clothes and into my natural habitat, jeans, a hoodie, and sneakers that had seen better days. 20 minutes later, I walked into Murphy's Bar and was immediately hit with the glorious chaos of tech people celebrating a successful launch. The place was packed with my team. Engineers still wearing their Flowgrid hoodies, analysts gesturing wildly while explaining something technical, our operations manager Katie doing a shot while the QA team cheered her on. This was my real family. These were the people who actually understood what I did, who knew the difference between an API and an algorithm, who'd worked alongside me through countless all-nighters and impossible deadlines. The moment I walked through the door, someone spotted me and yelled, "Noah's here," and suddenly I was engulfed in a wave of high fives, back slaps, and enthusiastic greetings that felt more genuine than anything I'd experienced at Harold's dinner. Mason appeared from the crowd holding 2 beers, one of which he shoved into my hand with a grin that suggested he was already several drinks ahead of me. "The man of the hour," he announced loudly, raising his beer in a toast. "The warehouse worker who built a unicorn." The entire bar erupted in cheers and laughter, and I couldn't help but laugh too because of course Mason knew about the dinner. I'd texted him earlier about Harold's introduction, and he'd been sending me sarcastic messages throughout the meal asking if I'd told them about the forklifts yet. "Cheers to that," I said, raising my own beer. "And cheers to you guys for pulling off a flawless deployment while I was suffering through the world's most awkward business dinner." "How awkward are we talking?" asked Jennifer. one of our senior engineers who had a PhD from MIT and could code circles around anyone I'd ever met. She was perched on a bar stool, looking genuinely curious about my suffering. Bloomberg aired a segment about me right in the middle of dinner. I said, taking a long drink of beer that tasted infinitely better than the expensive wine at Morton's. My father-in-law had spent the entire evening introducing me as a warehouse worker. And then suddenly, I'm on TV being called a billionaire CEO. The team absolutely lost it. People were laughing so hard they were crying, and Mason had to lean against the bar to keep from falling over. "No way," gasped Katie between laughs. "That actually happened? That's like something out of a movie." "Oh, it gets better," I said, warming to my audience. Right after the Bloomberg thing, Harold gets a call from Columbia Business School asking to confirm my $1.2 million donation to their entrepreneurship program. More shocked laughter, more disbelief. "Your father-in-law didn't know you donated over $1 million to Columbia?" Jennifer asked, her eyes wide. "My father-in-law didn't know I had over $1 million, period." I corrected. He thought I was one step above unemployed. Marcus, our head of data analytics, and a guy who could find patterns in chaos like some kind of mathematical wizard, shook his head in amazement. "How do you not know your son-in-law is a CEO? Like, did he never Google you? Did your wife never mention it?" "Apparently not," I said with a shrug that was more amused than bitter now that I was away from the actual situation. "They just assumed warehouse job meant, actually working in a warehouse, moving boxes, operating forklifts, that kind of thing. But you do work in warehouses," Mason said with mock seriousness. "Virtual ones. Very important distinction." "Oh, absolutely," I agreed. "I move digital boxes. Requires way less upper body strength." The team was in their element now, riffing on the absurdity of the situation, coming up with increasingly ridiculous scenarios about my supposed warehouse worker life. Someone suggested I should show up to the next family dinner in a forklift. Someone else said I should hand out business cards that said "Professional Box Mover" with my actual CEO title in tiny print at the bottom. Sarah, our youngest engineer who joined us fresh out of Stanford 6 months ago, raised her hand like we were in a classroom. Question: "Did you tell them about the Microsoft talks?" "Bloomberg did that for me," I said, which was fun because those talks are supposed to be confidential. But apparently Bloomberg has sources everywhere. "Is it actually happening?" Marcus asked, suddenly serious. "The acquisition?" This was the question everyone wanted to know, the one that actually mattered to the people in this room. Because if Microsoft bought Flowgrid, it would change everything. Their jobs, their equity, their futures. I owed them honesty. "Maybe," I said carefully. "We're in early discussions. Nothing's decided. But if it happens, I promise you guys will be taken care of. That's non-negotiable in any deal." The mood shifted slightly, becoming more serious, more real. These people had bet their careers on Flowgrid, on me, and they deserved to know where things stood. "Look," I continued, setting down my beer so I could gesture properly. "Whatever happens, whether we sell to Microsoft, whether we stay independent, whether we go public in a few years, you all are the reason this company works. Not me, not the investors. You, the people who actually build the product, who solve the problems, who make our clients' lives better." Katie raised her shot glass, which had somehow been refilled. "Damn right we do. We're the real MVPs." "Absolutely," I agreed. "Which is why, effective Monday, everyone's getting bonuses." The bar erupted again, this time with genuine excitement and gratitude. People were hugging, high-fiving. Someone started chanting "bonus, bonus, bonus," until Mason threw a peanut at them to shut them up. "How big are we talking?" Jennifer asked, always the practical one. "Big enough that you'll actually notice it in your bank account," I said. "Not retire to the Bahamas big, but definitely nice vacation and pay off some debt big. Except for people who left early last Friday," I added, looking directly at Mason who'd snuck out at 4:30 to catch a movie. His face fell in mock horror. "That was one time. I'd been here for 70 hours that week." "Exactly," I said with a grin. "And you left early. No bonus for you." The entire bar booed and threw peanuts at me while Mason protested loudly about labor laws and employee rights and how he was going to report me to HR. "We don't have HR," I pointed out. "You're thinking of Katie, who handles that stuff in addition to operations, and she's currently doing shots, so good luck with your complaint." Katie raised her glass in acknowledgement, spilling a little on her Flowgrid hoodie. Complaint denied, she announced with the authority of someone 3 drinks past tipsy. Mason can suffer. The night continued like that, drinking, laughing, telling stories about deployments gone wrong and clients who didn't understand technology, and that one time we almost lost a major contract because someone accidentally deleted a production database. These were my people. The ones who got it, who understood what we'd built together, who didn't care that I wore hoodies instead of suits or drove a Honda instead of a Tesla. They cared about the work, about solving problems, about building something that actually mattered. Around midnight, as the bar started to empty and people began calling Ubers to head home, Mason pulled me aside. Seriously, though, he said, the alcohol making him more sincere than usual. That must have been weird tonight. The dinner thing. It was surreal, I admitted, but also kind of satisfying. Like, I spent 2 years being underestimated by these people, and then watching their faces when they realized who I actually was. Yeah, that felt good. You're a petty man, Noah Lansing, Mason said with approval. I respect that. Thank you, I said. I try. He clapped me on the shoulder, swaying slightly. But for real, you handled it well. You could have been an asshole about it, rubbed it in their faces, made them feel terrible. But you were cool. That's good leadership. I saved all the asshole energy for you, I said. Hence the bonus thing. You're not actually withholding my bonus, right? Mason asked, suddenly worried. Of course not, I assured him. But I am going to bring it up at every team meeting for the next month. Fair, he conceded. I deserve that. I left Murphy's around 1 in the morning, pleasantly buzzed and genuinely happy in a way I hadn't been at the fancy steakhouse dinner. The night air was cool, the street was quiet, and my phone had finally stopped buzzing quite so aggressively. I had texts from Sophie asking when I'd be home, a few more investor emails I'd deal with tomorrow, and one message from Harold sent 20 minutes ago. Thank you again for tonight. Looking forward to the office visit. Harold. I smiled at that, typed back a quick anytime, and headed to my car. Tomorrow would bring more chaos, more interview requests, more questions about Microsoft, more family members suddenly interested in my life. But tonight, right now, I was just a guy who'd built something cool with a team of brilliant weirdos, and that felt pretty damn good. I got home around 2 in the morning, trying to be quiet as I fumbled with my keys at the front door, only to find Sophie waiting up for me on the couch. She was still in her dinner dress, a glass of wine in hand, her 4th or 5th of the evening, if I had to guess, and she had that look on her face. You know the one. The "we need to talk and I've been rehearsing this conversation in my head for the past 3 hours" look. I braced myself for the discussion I'd been avoiding all night. The one where she asked me why I never told her about the scope of my success, why I let her and her family think I was basically nobody, why our entire marriage might have been built on a foundation of miscommunication and assumptions. But instead of launching into the speech I could see forming behind her eyes, Sophie just looked at me for a long moment and said, "I'm sorry." Those 2 words hung in the air, simple and unexpected, and I felt something shift in my chest. I should have listened, she continued, setting down her wine glass with deliberate care. You tried to tell me about Flowgrid, about what you were building, and I didn't pay attention. I thought it was boring tech stuff, and I didn't realize that boring tech stuff was actually changing entire industries. She laughed, but it was tinged with sadness and embarrassment. I'm married to someone I don't actually know. That's pretty messed up, isn't it? I sat down next to her, still smelling like Murphy's Bar, beer and peanuts, and the kind of honest celebration that doesn't require expensive wine. It's not entirely your fault, I said, because it wasn't. I could have been more insistent. Could have made you sit down and actually understand what I was doing instead of just accepting that you weren't interested. But I should have been interested, Sophie countered. You're my husband. Your work is important to you, and I just dismissed it, like it didn't matter. She picked up her phone from the coffee table and showed me the screen. She'd been reading articles about Flowgrid, TechCrunch, Bloomberg, Forbes, the Wall Street Journal piece I'd mentioned at dinner. I've been reading about you for the past 2 hours, she said. About my own husband. That's insane. Better late than never. I offered with a slight smile, and she laughed again, this time more genuinely. I told Dad and Mom everything after you left, Sophie said. Well, everything I learned from Google, which is apparently more than I learned in 2 years of marriage. She paused, scrolling through her phone. Mom called Lydia crying. Happy crying, I think. She kept saying our son-in-law is on Bloomberg like it was the greatest achievement in family history. I could picture that scene perfectly. Sophie's mother, who'd always been kind to me but clearly worried her daughter had married someone without prospects, suddenly realizing that her son-in-law was more successful than anyone else in the family combined. And Lydia? I asked, genuinely curious about how my sister-in-law was handling the revelation. Lydia locked herself in her room and won't come out, Sophie said with a smirk. I think she's dying of embarrassment. She sent me a text that just said, I'm never showing my face at family dinner again. Dramatic, I commented. But fair. My phone buzzed again. It hadn't really stopped buzzing since I'd left Murphy's, and I glanced at the screen to see another text from Sophie, except she was sitting right next to me. I looked at her confused, and she gestured to my phone. Read it, she said. I opened the message. Dad told Mom. Everyone's shocked. They're proud. I'm sorry I didn't believe in you sooner. I looked up from my phone to see her watching me, vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. I mean it, she said softly. I'm really sorry, Noah. You deserved better than being treated like your work didn't matter. It's okay, I said, and I meant it. The anger and frustration I'd felt during dinner had mellowed into something more manageable, more forgiving. You just married your own case study in not judging books by their covers. She smiled at that, a real smile that reached her eyes. I guess I did. She leaned her head on my shoulder, and we sat like that for a moment in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes after you've survived something weird and difficult together. So, Sophie said eventually, are you actually going to sell to Microsoft? Maybe, I said honestly. It's complicated. On one hand, it's a lot of money and great resources for the team. On the other hand, I like being independent, making my own decisions, not having to answer to corporate overlords. Whatever you decide, Sophie said, I support you, even if I don't fully understand the technical details. That's all I ask, I said. Well, that and maybe occasionally listening when I talk about work. Deal, she agreed. But you have to explain it in terms I can understand. Use analogies. Compare it to shopping or reality TV or something I actually know about. I'll work on my metaphor game, I promised. My phone buzzed again. Jesus, didn't these people sleep? But this time it was worth checking. Mason had sent a photo from Murphy's. The entire team crowded into the frame, drinks raised, grinning like idiots with the caption, "The real MVPs," followed by about 15 emojis. I showed it to Sophie. That's my team, I said. The people who actually make Flowgrid work. They look happy, she observed. They are happy, I confirmed. Because they're building something that matters, and they're doing it with people who get it. No pretense, no judgment, just good work and mutual respect. Is that a dig at my family? Sophie asked, but she was smiling. Maybe a little, I admitted. I leaned back into the couch, feeling the exhaustion of the day finally catching up with me. Tomorrow would bring a whole new set of challenges. Harold's office visit, more media requests, the continuing Microsoft negotiations, probably some awkward family phone calls. But right now, in this moment, I was exactly where I needed to be. You know what the best part of tonight was? I said to Sophie. Watching your dad's face when he realized, she guessed. That was pretty good, I acknowledged. But no, the best part was knowing I didn't need anyone's validation. Not Harold's, not his business friends, not even Bloomberg's. I built something real, something valuable, and I did it my way. In jeans and a turtleneck, Sophie added. In jeans and a turtleneck, I confirmed. Like a proper tech CEO. She laughed and stood up, pulling me toward the bedroom. Come on, warehouse worker. You need sleep. That's billionaire warehouse worker to you. I corrected, and she threw a couch pillow at my head. As I drifted off to sleep that night, my phone finally silent on the nightstand, I couldn't help but smile at the thought of Harold's face the next time Bloomberg introduced me. Meet the tech world's newest billionaire, formerly known as just a warehouse worker. Yeah, I thought. That had a nice ring to it. Success isn't about wearing a tie or having a corner office or impressing people at fancy steakhouse dinners. Success is knowing you built something that matters, treated people with respect, and stayed true to yourself even when everyone else thought you should be someone different. And as I finally surrendered to sleep, I made a mental note to wear my oldest, most casual hoodie to Harold's office visit, just to make a point, because some things are too fun to resist.